One of the coolest helicopters to ever have been flown as an air ambulance has just dropped off their patient and they're headed back home. The weather is great, the pilot is super experienced, and he's doing everything right. The med crew are all on the same page, yet something goes terribly wrong, forcing the pilot to fight the aircraft with the assistance of the flight paramedic until eventually the helicopter crash lands on top of a local business. You will never believe the absolutely ridiculous yet completely preventable reason that brought down this helicopter. The full story of Lifelink 3 coming up on this episode of the Dr. Medic. Now, just as I've done with every story previous to this, I am going to mention the operator and the brand name of this service, but this crash took place 25 years ago on April 14th, 2000, and I would say it's not really reflective of how the operator or the flight service do things today, so just keep that in mind as we go along. And with that being said, the operator in this instance is Air Methods, whom I have spoken about extensively on this channel before, and I'll place some links down in the description below so you can check them out and find out more about Air Methods. But the quick and skinny of it is that Air Methods is basically the largest air medical provider in the entire world, with 300 bases and 450 aircraft in just about every state. But back in 2000, across all the services that they had at the time, they had just a fraction of those bases and aircraft. But one of those services was called Lifelink 3. Now, Lifelink 3 is one of the more rare air medical setups, being that they are a non-profit consortium where basically their primary funding source, in addition to medical reimbursement, comes from being supported by many of the hospitals and healthcare systems across Minnesota and even in Wisconsin. Now, Lifelink 3 has been around since about 1985 and has grown substantially over the years to where they now have 11 helicopters across Minnesota and Wisconsin. Now, an interesting background with Lifelink 3 was that there was this kind of oddball sort of ground ambulance service, They kind of used vans back in the late 1970s who would help transport patients who had hemodynamic monitoring devices. In other words, complicated types of devices like maybe balloon pumps and stuff that were just way too advanced for any out-of-hospital providers at the time, like their EMTs and paramedics that they had locally. And so this service, which was called BMRA, would help transport these patients around Minnesota. They were kind of like an early version of a critical care ground transport. Now, they eventually scored a fixed-wing aircraft, and then in 1985, the original 3 major hospitals in the area with Abbott Northwestern, St. Paul Ramsey, and the University of Minnesota all collectively decided to purchase BMRA, then turn them into a 501c3 nonprofit, which formed Lifelink 3. Now, I believe they started flying rotor wing in the Sikorsky S-76 and an A model, and eventually had some stints in both the Bell 206 and the Bell 407. Now, they currently fly in the former AW, now just Leonardo 119KXs, which is a pretty neat aircraft and pretty rare for EMS in the United States. But back around the time of this crash, they were flying the ultra cool Bell 222. Now, this particular aircraft with tail number 225 Lima Lima was a U model, which had the retractable landing gear removed and replaced with permanent skids. Now, I guess there's a bit less maintenance with the skids, and it allowed for some bigger fuel tanks as well. Now, the airframe was owned by Air Methods and had a total of 7,885 hours on the airframe, and it had been just 39 hours since its last inspection. Now, this model was powered by 2 Lycoming LTS 101 750C-1 turboshaft engines, each making about 650 horsepower. Now, this is one of the super cool aircraft for EMS, well, just in general, really, with the 222 and the 230 variants having the massive twin blade rotor head. Now, patients on this version of the helicopter are loaded in from the side. It's got plenty of power for the mission of EMS, and it was always a pretty safe aircraft and pretty reliable. Now, unfortunately, in 1995, they stopped making the 2-bladed version, which is the 222 and the 230, Now, they did continue to make the four-bladed version, which is the 430, for a few years, but after 1995, it just got more and more difficult to obtain parts and maintain the 222, and as of today, I do believe that there are no more 222s in the EMS in the US. In fact, I believe there are less than 5 operational 222s left anywhere in the United States, with many of them being bought up and used as the primary air ambulance helicopter for South Africa through 2 big companies, one called Henley Air and the other Rocket Hems. Coolest air ambulance name ever. But I do know of at least one operating 222 in the civilian side of things in the country, and the owner did get me some good footage for this video that we'll get to here pretty shortly. The weather was absolutely perfect, with the temperature at 16 degrees and the dew point at 4 degrees. The visibility was, over 10 miles, no clouds at all. The weather was absolutely perfect. Now, the pilot in this accident was 39-year-old Christopher Cruz. Now, what a cool name for a helicopter pilot. Pilot Cruz. Now, Pilot Cruz at the time held a commercial pilot certificate with ratings for single and multi-engine in airplanes, and was obviously also a helicopter pilot and had a Class 1 medical with no waivers. He had racked up a total of 3,406 hours with 359 hours in the Bell 222. And not only was this guy a pilot, he was also a paramedic. Pilot Cruz went to paramedic school in 1985, right before he joined the Army and learned how to fly Hueys. After his time in the Army is when he became an air ambulance pilot for Air Methods and Lifelink 3. Now, in the afternoon of April 14th, 2000, Pilot Cruz, his flight paramedic, had just dropped off a patient at Abbott Northwestern Hospital and had departed at 16:05 hours local time and were headed back to their base in St. Paul. Now, the 222 is a bigger twin-engine aircraft, so there is room for one of the med crew to sit up front when they do not have a patient on board. Added set of eyes, added safety. In this case, it was flight paramedic William. Now, he was sitting up front and seated to the left of Pilot Cruz just about 7 minutes after departure from Abbott Northwestern, and while flying over an extremely populated area directly between the twin cities of Minneapolis and St. Paul, and just about 2 minutes from their intended destination of St. Paul Downtown Airport, which is where their base was, Pilot Cruz starts to feel this tiny little subtle tick-tick in the cyclic. It's not really affecting things, he can just feel it, but he turns his autopilot off and he cycles it back on again, and again, he feels the tick in the cyclic, but it's not really affecting too much right now. He's still going to attempt to land. Now, he's flying over an extremely populated area and has to worry about noise abatement rules, and his normal routine would be to climb to about 900 feet above the ground as he sets up for his approach to the downtown airport. But just as he starts to climb, the aircraft violently pitches straight up and actually continues all the way over backwards until the nose of the aircraft is now pointed directly at the ground. All the while, Pilot Cruz is unable to move or control any of his flight controls except for his pedals. Normally, he would have one hand on the cyclic and another on the collective, which he did, and he was trying to keep the collective down. But the cyclic is just not responding, and he is unable to move it, so he takes his left hand off of the collective so he can use 2 hands to try and overpower the cyclic. But just as he tries to use the 2 hands, the cyclic kind of chills out, and it kind of moves back forward, seemingly on its own. And for a moment there, everything seems like maybe it's going back to normal, but then the whole thing seems to happen all over again over the next minute or so, at least according to the pilot. And the aircraft is now 100% out of control, with multiple instances of being inverted, rolling, and looping over. Now, Pilot Cruz is literally fighting with everything he has to try and gain control of this helicopter. But remember, Paramedic William is sitting next to him, and Paramedic William saw Chris take his left hand off of the collective to fight the cyclic. And as they were rolling and looping, Paramedic Williams somehow had the wherewithal, and he noticed that the collective went back up on its own, and he, yes, the paramedic, actually reached over, seemingly without being told to, and was able to lower the collective on his own using both hands until Pilot Cruz could regain control of the aircraft. Now, at this point, the helicopter is less than 100 feet off of the ground, and Pilot Cruz is still struggling with the aircraft, and he attempts to put the helicopter down in a parking lot. But at the same time, he's kind of trying to dodge power lines and other buildings, and eventually is really left with no other choice than to use his collective to flare and slow his speed and slow the descent while also jamming full left pedal, and he's finally able to place the helicopter directly on the rooftop of a 2-story building. Now, the aircraft ends up right on its belly, the skids are spread out, Cruz kills the power and fuel, and both of them are able to exit the aircraft with little to minor injuries. What in the world could have caused this pilot to completely lose control of this aircraft? Well, brace yourselves, as this is probably going to raise your blood pressure just a little bit. You should probably sit down for this one. Now, the helicopter is lifted off the rooftop by crane and trailered over to a hangar at St. Paul Downtown Airport so the NTSB can begin their investigation. Based on multiple interviews that I have completed over the last year, the following is what occurred in that hangar. As we talk about this, just let me kind of set the scene for you. This is just 1 or 2 days following the crash, and we are in the hangar with the destroyed 222 helicopter. It's sitting there inside the building. Now, the preliminary teardown has already been completed, which basically consists of a very preliminary inspection of all the parts and equipment to sort of gain a quick understanding of anything obvious that may have occurred. For example, if the tail rotor was missing or something like that, that would be an obvious preliminary indicator of the possible cause. Anyway, that preliminary teardown has already occurred, and there is a group of people standing there in the hangar representing several different agencies and organizations, and among them include the lead NTSB investigator, the pilot, Christopher Cruz, and the mechanic who was responsible for taking care of this very aircraft. Now, during that preliminary teardown, the investigators found several dowel pins sitting at the bottom of the engine compartment of the crashed aircraft. Now, one of the investigators is telling the group that he found the dowel pins, and he's holding them in his hand. And the mechanic is standing right there. He's present and he's listening, and then sees the actual dowel pins in the investigator's hands, and a look of fear and apprehension comes across his face, and he immediately goes over to his toolbox. Yes, his toolbox, and pulls out several identical dowel pins and brings them over to the group. He says something to the effect of, "I found these dowel pins at the bottom of the engine bay about a year ago. I wasn't sure what they went to, so I put them in my toolbox." The lead NTSB investigator then takes the dowel pins that he was holding and he throws them on the ground and says, quote, "Well, I guess we have this one figured out, don't we?" Can you imagine the tension in that room? Can you imagine the anger that the pilot must have felt? And in all honesty, can you imagine the embarrassment that the mechanic must have felt? Well, we'll kind of come back to some of that stuff. But first, what do these dowel pins even do? Now, dowel pins they're a simple little device. There's nothing major about them. Dowel pins are a simple cylindrical item that can be used in many forms of manufacturing to help ensure very precise alignment of two flat surfaces prior to being able to actually torque that surface down. Probably the most common example that I can think of in my life with dowel pins, with metal manufacturing and dowel pins, might be installing a cylinder head on a car engine, where you first align the cylinder head over the dowel pins to help line up the head with the engine block before actually torquing down the head bolts. It's the same thing here. Now, you can see in this video here, which just happens to be from tail number November 322 Alpha Whiskey, which is one of the very few remaining Bell 222s anywhere in the world, with just a handful of them left in the United States. Now, this aircraft is owned by a gentleman named Jim Hitch and is serviced by Drew at Helicopter Maintenance Solutions out of North Carolina. Now, this service center really seems like they do just about everything for helicopters, from regular maintenance to overhauls, parts, sales, and even paint. Now, this helicopter just happened to have its transmission out a few months ago for service, and Drew was gracious enough to film the actuator support assembly in pretty good detail here before he put it back together. So big thank you to both Drew and the owner, Jim. But anyway, as you can see here, the dowel pins they're right here and assist with aligning the surfaces of the actuator support assembly and the actual front of the transmission. And here's the important part. For these dowel pins to have fallen out, that means that one or probably many of the 8 nuts that hold this actuator support assembly on must have come so loose that the dowel pin would have fallen out, which kind of leaves that actuator support assembly kind of just dangling there, which then the Lifelink 3 mechanic found those dowel pins almost a year ago, and he just chucked them into his toolbox. But wait, there's more. Now remember that this crash occurred on April 14th in the year 2000. And back then, the 222 was not an uncommon aircraft to use in the air ambulance industry, with one of the bigger users of the 222 being CareFlight out of Texas, who had 2, 3, 4, or 5 of them. Now, one of those CareFlight Bell 222s was tail number November 143 Charlie Foxtrot. Now, one day, this particular helicopter underwent a daily inspection to which the mechanic found that the support studs on the very same pylon-mounted actuator support assembly seemed to be a little loose. Now, these support studs hold this actuator support assembly up against the transmission of the helicopter, and the support assembly is then secured with 8 nuts, 4 of them across the top right here, and 4 of them on the bottom. This mechanic at CareFlight, sensing a deeper issue, decided to check the torque on all 8 of these nuts. When checking one of them, the stud actually broke off with less than 10 inch-pounds of force, and all 7 of the remaining nuts were found to be under-torqued. Now, a deeper inspection actually found that the support assembly was loose and that the holes all along the bottom were sort of wallowed out and elongated. Now, this mechanic was able to fix this broken stud. He replaced the entire actuator support assembly and then returned the aircraft to service. This CareFlight mechanic was so concerned with what he found that he filed a service difficulty report with the FAA with a strongly worded and specific recommendation that the Bell 222 and all of its variants all across the United States be inspected immediately to check the torque of these nuts holding this pylon support assembly in place. Why was he so concerned about this? Yes, loose nuts are not good, but why did he seem so concerned about this particular issue? And what does this pylon support assembly even do? Well, the quick and skinny of it is this, that the pylon support holds the 3 main controls for the main rotor blade. Both the cyclic and the collective controls are operated through actuators that are attached directly to this pylon assembly. As you can see here, you can see them moving up and down, controlling the swash plate. You can imagine that if this pylon assembly came loose, that it would make it awfully difficult for any pilot to be able to control the aircraft, and is probably going to lead to losing control and crashing the helicopter. I'd say that's why this mechanic at CareFlight was so concerned about this that he would take the extra effort to write up this service difficulty report to the FAA in hopes that the FAA would do something about it, primarily by sharing the information with Bell 222 operators and mechanics all over the world, at least all over the United States. But remember, this crash took place in April 14th, 2000. And what was the date that this CareFlight mechanic filed this service difficulty report with the FAA? October 27th, 1999, almost 6 months prior to this crash. But remember, the CareFlight has more than one 222. So just 2 days later, in response to finding the issue on tail number 143 Charlie Foxtrot, the mechanic also checked tail number 144 and again found that all 8 nuts were found to be under-torqued. And again, he submitted another service difficulty report, this time on October 29th, 1999. So now, the FAA has documentation that not 1, but 2 Bell 222s have experienced a complete loss of torque on all 8 mounting nuts for this pylon support assembly. And what did the FAA do about it? Nothing. Then the crash occurs on April 14th, 2000. The NTSB investigator discovers that the LifeLink 3 mechanic found the dowel pins in his toolbox, which matched the dowel pins in the investigator's hands that he found in the engine bay of the crashed helicopter. And then, about 1 month later, Bell Helicopters did issue an alert service bulletin to all Bell 222 operators to inspect and check the torque on the 8 nuts on the pylon support assembly. Now remember though, an alert service bulletin is a non-mandatory notice that is sent to operators and mechanics, usually from the manufacturer of the helicopter or maybe the engine itself, as a means to encourage the service to be completed. But the FAA issues airworthiness directives, which are mandatory and are legally enforceable as regulation placed upon the operator or the owner of an aircraft. So did the FAA ever issue an airworthiness directive on this issue? They did, but not until January of 2001. So what was the NTSB's probable cause of this accident? The loss of clamp-up force between the transmission case and the pylon-mounted actuator support assembly, which resulted in fatigue failure of the threaded studs and dowel pins, the failure of the flight control system, the helicopter control not being possible after the flight control failure, and the inadequate maintenance procedures by the company maintenance personnel. Now, I did reach out to Air Methods to get an official comment from them on this story, as I wanted to know what the reporting process was for their mechanics in a situation like this, and whether or not they made any changes from it, and if so, what were those changes. And even though Air Methods remained the operator for LifeLink 3 all the way up until somewhere around 2018, they got back to me and said that they have no comment because LifeLink 3 is not affiliated with Air Methods. Man, there are a lot of lessons here, and 2 of them are super obvious. First, if something doesn't seem right, it should be reported. Obviously, the LifeLink 3 mechanic should have investigated the source of those dowel pins immediately, and if he couldn't, find the source, should probably put the aircraft out of service until he could report it and bring in more resources, talk to other mechanics, whoever, to identify the cause. And 2, the FAA simply needs to act faster when they have reports, especially multiple reports of equipment or hardware failure, like the CareFlight mechanic found. You can't wait that long. You can't. Now, I hope the few folks that still fly 222s in the United States check out this service bulletin and the airworthiness directive if they have not already done so. And I also hope that the largest air ambulance operator of 222s today in the world, which is Rocket Hems out of South Africa, also sees the story and checks all of their aircraft immediately. Man, why don't we have cool air ambulance names in the US like Rocket Hems? Either way, I'll post those airworthiness directive in the service bulletin in the description below for sure, so take a look. Now, a rarity, but a quick request from the viewers. A story like this takes me many months to investigate, and in this case, it actually took over a year. For instance, the information about the NTSB investigator finding the dowel pins while the mechanic was standing there, this information was nowhere to be found in the actual NTSB report or any other public document, and instead took many months of searching for a source, and then even more difficult to confirm the validity of the source. Same thing for the CareFlight information and all that documentation. It was not mentioned in the final report and was nowhere to be listed in that report. This channel is not a job for me, and I do it in hopes that we can share the information, learn from these mistakes and be safer in the future. The number one thing that makes that possible is for you to like this video, subscribe to this channel, and probably most of all, to share it with someone. So if you thought that this was a worthwhile video, please show me some love by doing all those things. Thanks for taking the time to watch. Y'all fly safe, be nice to each other, and I will see you on the next episode.